Is it best for Rucker McGroarty and the Winnipeg Jets to kiss and make up? Find out on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said at the start, we're going to be kicking it off with Rutger McGroarty discussions, and obviously that's been a very touchy subject with a lot of folks. Winnipeg fans, I'm sure, are probably tired of this saga, and honestly, you would think that both the Jets and McGorty are also tired of the saga. But, it's still ongoing, still a daily discussion topic, as there continues to be a level of radio silence from at least one particular camp, while the Jets are trying to push their side of things on the other side. So lots of interesting thought processes going on here. And I guess the biggest question for all of this is, at the end of everything here, is McGorty just going to end up back in Winnipeg? Like, is this really worth going through all this trouble and burning communication bridges and going through all of this hassle, to find out that you don't really have it better elsewhere? I mean, the grass just really isn't greener in many other parts. So we'll talk about that in just a quick minute. Before we kick that off, though, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more, because as all of our playoffs have winded down and the sports maybe is not sporting the way we want it to, summer is, a bit of a quieter sports period, but FanDuel wants to help keep it hot with a lot of great offers for all customers, starting with a boost and a daily bonus. That's right, there's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, I just talked a little bit about the grass not always being greener elsewhere, and I think that's a really big point of note when it comes to players the Jets have traded, right? When you think about Patrick Laine and Pierre-Luc Dubois and Jack Roslovic, I think of all of those guys, Roslovic has probably had the smoothest run recently, and that's generally speaking. He swapped several different teams. He's now in, Carolina, I think. And so you often find that, players who have asked to leave, Trouba included, sure, they may sign some big long-term deals, and that's great. But in terms of their actual performance and the way that their teams have performed, most of them really haven't had much to write home about. I look at New York as being the most successful of all of these teams. Roslovic passed through there, of course. Trouba has been there and is now perhaps going to get traded at some point. You just don't really see them, other than the Rangers, really being all that successful. Kopp went to Detroit, got paid, hasn't really seen much of a recent streak of success. And I turn back to the Jets, right? And look, Winnipeg has a whole host of problems. They are a flawed team, and I think everyone knows that. But when I look at the present roster conditions, when I think about the direction the franchise wants to move in, and I look at the fact that, quite frankly, McGorty has a legitimate chance to fight for a roster spot for the start of the season this particular year, I just don't understand why we've gone through this whole song and dance. I know that April was apparently the tipping point for all of this, and I don't know if it was his agent that looked at all of this and thought, if Perfetti's not even getting in, why would my client really get a shot? And maybe that is true. Maybe that, plus the Jets saying, we can't promise you a roster spot as soon as you arrive, was enough to sort of piss off the whole package. But I think to myself, it seems a little gut reactionary, right? I just don't feel like this was necessary, especially with what sounds like radio silence from Rucker McGroarty's camp. And I feel like if McGorty really does start to reconsider things, which Mike McIntyre did suggest his camp is maybe going to reevaluate this, since, a lot of these other NHL teams that the Jets have tried to trade him to have ended up backing away from it. I guess for me, I sort of wonder if mending fences and making up is honestly in the best interest of both parties. McGorty's trade value right now has to be pretty low. I can't imagine that there are many teams out there that are really willing to pony up for a problem child. And for McGroarty, his rep is kind of not great right now. I'll be honest. I don't know that it's as bad as McIntyre has suggested, or that Muratatesh has also suggested. But I can't imagine that there are a lot of teams that view him favorably. I'm sure there are plenty of teams that would still take a waiver on him, but probably when he hits free agency or at an extreme discount when it comes to a trade value. So I just feel like when you're talking about teams that are playoff competitive, that are potentially fighting among the top rungs of their division, and that are also going to have roster availability for a said player to actually get into the lineup, I just don't really think there are many better options than the Jets. I keep circling around and thinking, of the playoff competitive teams. I mean, maybe Colorado, but he's not going to Colorado. The Avs aren't going to trade for him. They don't have the assets anymore. And I can't imagine the Jets would want to trade to a really competitive rival like that anyways. But I just think all of these different scenarios and sort of conditions make me think that at the end of all of this, maybe it's just best for everyone if McGroarty stays a Jet. He can kind of rehab the relationship, and I don't think it would be that hard. I mean, this whole thing feels like, his agent and maybe himself sort of forced a gamble that he thought was going to go very differently than it actually has. And with the Jets not necessarily having a ton of leverage here, but still being relatively in control for at least the rest of this season, I get the sense that maybe he overplayed his hand and is perhaps regretting it. If I was in McGorty's shoes and I went through the same process, I'd probably be feeling like I made a bit of a mistake. And it's true. You have plenty of tensions between players and their teams all the time. Just look at some of the guys who have threatened to hold out at camp, some of them who haven't, shown up and awaited big contract extensions. We've seen it happen plenty of times. So this is nothing really new. It's just part of the business side of things. I just sort of question why the communications bridge has kind of been burned. That I don't really get. It's weird that McGorty's camp really hasn't been that active since April. Now, I'm sure they've put stuff out there and tried to leak certain things to force a move faster, but by the same token, it doesn't really seem like they're talking all that much with Winnipeg's front office. So for me, I just don't know what to make of this, but I feel like after all that we've seen, I just feel like it's best for everyone if they kind of kiss and make up and get over this. I don't really... I mean, I'm not going to say that I'm not irritated by all of what has happened, but by the same token, I'm not going to continue to hold a blood grudge against McGroarty's camp for doing this. I mean, it's the leverage that he's been given from, his rights as an NCAA draftee, and I can understand if he wants to exercise them. But I feel like there's just not many better opportunities than the Jets. I don't say that as a Winnipeg fan. I just say that generally speaking. If you think about the number of playoff teams that can actually give him a playoff spot, there's just not really many out there. And I think the Jets are in a particularly unique position because they're trying to play more youth. Of the teams out there that are actively committing to having a youth movement, the Jets might have the most open and most available roster spots in pretty good places. Winnipeg could have some really big gaps already because they're down Monahan and Toffoli. They might be down Ehlers. And so I just asked myself, for McGroarty's sake, right? What really is the best path for his career? And I really feel like just give the Jets a chance. Giving the Jets a chance might be in everyone's best interest. The Jets are going to retain one of their top prospects and a guy who was labeled as a future captain. McGroarty can kind of work on rehabbing that relationship and getting NHL reps and a paycheck. All of that stuff really does matter. And I feel like it bypasses all of the silliness and drama, and you get back to just playing hockey. I feel like that's what it should be. That should be the priority. That should be the focus. And I think it would be better for everyone involved. Now, I did mention that, of course, there's some narrative stuff here that I think the Jets have tried to control. And we'll talk about what that might look like and how that's going to continue to shape over the next few months. But before we go any further, just wanted to shout out our friends and partners at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Just like building a championship team requires all sorts of components, they've got plenty of things from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. No matter what you're into, whether it's speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one vehicle, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you get your money back. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge victories. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just chatting about some of the stuff with, the Rutger McGroarty situation, and I wanted to focus a little bit on the fact that we are kind of dealing with Winnipeg pushing a bit of a narrative right now. I think we've really seen after the initial stage and the initial leaks that the Jets kind of want teams to understand that, they're not the ones at fault, or at least feel that way, right? They want to make McGorty look like he's kind of entitled and spoiled, which is an understandable approach. You're talking about a player who has kind of tried to force his way out, tried to force his hand, and I think they want to make it seem like his camp is being unparticipative, which I don't know if you have to actually do that much convincing. I kind of feel like the non-communication stuff has probably done that for the Jets already, but by the same token, it's just a bit of an unusual situation. You don't often see this, until recently, I would say this wasn't something that happened that frequently. I would say the past couple of seasons, it's starting to increase in frequency, and you're seeing it a little bit more often. But throughout all of this, I think the Jets are really trying to sell this narrative, and I don't know if that's the best approach, to be honest. For one thing, the reports that are coming out from like McIntyre and Atesh and other reporters, it's not really shocking for anyone, right? The fact that they're suggesting that teams were suddenly scared off by all of this, by what they're hearing from Rucker's camp, and that's why the trades broke down last weekend, doesn't really add up for me. I mean, like, teams had to know that this was a situation. And so my read personally is that this was why they broke down during the draft, or maybe even before. I don't really buy that teams didn't know this was a thing. I feel like it was kind of understood as to why McGorty was sort of backing away before the draft hit. And where I kind of tend to see this really boiling over is that the Jets were pretty firm in their asking price, right? I think that's what was the real sticking point, is Winnipeg wanted like a first and maybe a roster player of some sort for McGorty, or a similar package, something really hefty, because he is relatively speaking a pro-ready player. I mean, his skating does have some issues, and obviously he hasn't played in the NHL yet, but of the prospects and the development that you've got, he's ready to step into a lineup somewhere, whether it's with the Jets or somewhere else. And so you kind of factor that into the price. And I think Winnipeg probably was unwilling to budge because they view him as a top prospect, and they may feel that they have more time this offseason to resolve this question. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that particular lens and angle. I think the time is actually running out pretty quickly for the Jets to get this solved. But in terms of controlling the narrative, I think we're going to see Winnipeg continue to try and perhaps force something out of this. And I do worry that at some point they're just going to sort of back themselves into a corner and perhaps devalue the asset considerably. That's where I feel like playing nice and sort of making up on both sides is actually helpful. I don't know if you want to keep trying to discredit McGorty's camp, because that seems like you're also doing some stuff to maybe burn some bridges. And perhaps that relationship really is unsalvageable. Maybe it's well past the point of no return. There's no point in even discussing this. And, at this point, it's too late. But I still feel like there is time to salvage something. I think that there is still a potential relationship that you could pull out of this. And I just don't know what else Winnipeg could really glean from, going through all of these exercises. I just feel like, McGorty's trade asset is probably, or trade value as an asset's probably pretty low. I can't imagine that there are many teams that are eager to give Winnipeg now, a first rounder or anything of that nature. Maybe you could try and do a swap for a disgruntled player, but I I don't really see it, right? I can't really imagine that there's much out there. I mean, maybe there was like a Mcgorty thing or something. Apparently, Carolina was in on Mcgorty. I've heard Montreal. There's been a few other teams like Buffalo that have inquired. Minnesota was also sort of intrigued, I guess, and then they drafted Zeev Buim. So I think that there's plenty of teams that would perhaps consider it, but I don't know if they were really willing to pay what the Jets were asking. And that's where I think the real sticking point was. I don't think it's anything about surprise from what his camp is asking for. I think the only way I would, change my perspective on that is it could have been that, McGroarty's camp was saying one thing to the Jets and telling opposing teams something else, right? If they were using the roster spot excuse with Winnipeg just to force the issue. But it sounds like they've been pretty consistent in the messaging. So with that in mind, I don't really buy that teams are shocked or really put off by this as a surprise, right? I think it's established. I think it's known. And I think the big sticking point is just no one wants to pay up for that. So, I think this narrative is going to continue to swing back and forth until we see a resolution. And again, I think the more that we see like smear campaigns and stuff kind of come out of this, I do wonder if that impacts Winnipeg's standing among prospects in the future. I don't know what players who are watching this are thinking. Not that I would necessarily imagine all of them are taking McGorty's side here, but, they are observing, they are drawing their own conclusions, and they'll see some of the same stuff that happened with Perfetti in that, Cole was not really given a big role with the team, and it took, a couple of coaches now for that to really become crystallized that he has a major potential future with the Jets. So it's a weird state to be in. I don't like having to go through all of this sort of mudslinging, and to be fair, it's not like it's been particularly bad, but I feel like we're seeing more and more stuff about Rucker being viewed by the league as entitled or something. And I just, I mean, it could be true, and I wouldn't be shocked if it is, actually, because let's be real, most NHL franchises are probably pretty similar and in a similar mindset as Winnipeg is. They probably look at an entitled, spoiled kid coming in who thinks he's better than what's on the roster and is demanding a roster spot, and they probably look at him like the Cutter Gauthier situation where they were like, don't want to deal with that. Cutter is obviously super talented, but the way that he forced his exit out of Philly left a big sour taste in a lot of teams' mouths. So, I mean, I sit here and I'm like, this just doesn't seem like a healthy environment for anyone. I feel like the sooner the Jets can sort of wrap this up and stop having to try and control this narrative, I think it's going to be better for everyone. I feel like, I keep coming back to the idea that at some point, maybe it's just time for Rucker to sign the contract. Get that underway, get paid, and maybe spend some time in Winnipeg, maybe play a few seasons here, see if it's really that bad. If at the end of it, he really just hates his time here, I totally respect it. I think I would actually prefer if he just was upfront and said, I don't want to play in Winnipeg. If that's the sticking point, I don't blame him. I'm not going to be mad about it. He didn't get to choose where he was drafted, so I don't necessarily hold that specific thing against him. But if this whole roster spot thing continues to be a sticking point, then just come to camp and fight it out. Like, the Jets aren't going to tell him that he's got a roster spot from day one. There's very few players that they do that to. And even with Kyle Connor had to spend quite a bit of time in the AHL. He spent like half a season there. So for me, I just feel like, it doesn't make sense to continue to sit this one out and maybe even tarnish your reputation around the league for not much gain. And for the Jets, continuing to try and force this and really make him seem like he's entitled and spoiled doesn't really make the Jets look all that much better. In fact, it kind of makes me wonder, like, who is really telling the truth here? And I don't know. It's a weird situation. The way that it's played out is very strange. It's a little off in many respects, and I don't like it. And any time that you have this sort of drama and tension, it just doesn't really lead to many good things. So it'd be nice if they can kind of cross the bridge, somebody shakes a hand somewhere, and we move on. Because the longer this goes on, the less likely it is that anyone walks away happy. So Here's to, I guess, getting over their differences and making something happen. Let me know if you think that this relationship is even repairable. Do you think it's well past the point? I have kind of maintained that I thought it was past the point of no return, but I'm welcome to be, having a changed mind. I'd love to see things get better and not be so feisty, but it's part of the business, right? It just is what it is. Now, speaking of the start of the season, the NHL released the schedule for next season not too long ago, and I wanted to talk about the start of Winnipeg season, which we'll see a big season opener in the in on the road in Edmonton against the Stanley Cup finalists. So we'll talk about that in just a quick moment. But before we go any further, just thought you'd love to hear about our partners at FanDuel. I love sports, and I love them so much that I really wish they wouldn't end. But of course, NHL playoffs are over. The Jets were out in the first round, so it's been a very long time without Winnipeg hockey. We have all this offseason drama, I guess, to fill our news cycles. But if you're actually wanting to watch sports, unless you're watching like the Euros or Copa America or baseball, maybe some racing if you're into F1 and IndyCar and NASCAR, there's a fair amount of sports, but not one of the big ones that I think a lot of us are really into, like no hockey, no American football, and some of those bigger sports that tend to get a lot of play in this side of the hemisphere. It's been a little bit quiet. So, you're looking to fill the void, and FanDuel totally gets that. They want to help you keep the sports going whenever you want. All you have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. This summer, FanDuel is also keeping things spicy by hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Head on over to FanDuel.com and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just wrapping up with some thoughts. Obviously, there's been lots of drama around McGroarty and everything, and, that's kind of put a bit of a damper on next season, but it is what it is. I'm not going to get too stressed about it. I mean, whatever happens, right? I mean, at the end of the day, Winnipeg can only control so much. And I just want everyone to kind of walk away satisfied with some sort of reasonable outcome. Whether we actually get that, I don't know. We'll see. But all that said, right, the Jets have their season schedule. Let's talk about the start of it because we're going to get a nice tour of the West, both some Central and Pacific Division opponents. Kicking us off, though, the season opener is going to be on the road in Edmonton. Yay. Really would love to actually have the Jets season start at home, but I mean, whatever. I guess we can't all have what we desire. Getting to face the Oilers on the road, the Stanley Cup finalists, kind of interesting, I guess. Should be a fun game. I think for the Jets, you can maybe call it a measuring stick, even though it's not going to be the same Oilers team that they faced last time. Maybe Matt Savoy will be taking the lineup, which would be, I guess, for some Jets fans, perhaps a little bit of full circle since he spent some time as an ICE member, and now he's potentially getting into the lineup for Edmonton over, Ryan McLeod, who obviously is now a Sabre. I don't know quite what the whole Savoy read is. I don't know if he's going to be a top contributor there. I feel like he'll be a nice complimentary goal scorer for McDavid or something like that. Who knows if that's going to be out of preseason or camp or whatever. But for the Jets, right, I think this should be a fun game. I think it's a cool way to start the season. Like I said, though, just kind of wished it was at home. Winnipeg's actual home opener will be just a couple days later on the 11th. They'll be taking on Chicago, and the Chicago team has made a lot of additions. I don't know that all of the additions are actually all that good. It's a lot of veteran players who are older and slower and not particularly in their primes anymore. So I feel like they're still going to be bad, but hey, I mean, it's going to be a stronger Hawks team, should be a closer game than usual. So yay, I guess. Then you've got a couple days later, Minnesota, and the Wild are kind of in that bracket of being a team that I feel like is sort of stuck in a perpetual mediocre hell. I feel like they've just not really been able to climb their way out, but they have drafted some really cool prospects, and it seems like they've made a couple of acquisitions that I think could actually improve their team. So I do think at some point in the long term, they'll be annoying again, especially once Volstedt makes the NHL full-time. But until then, could be some regrowing and rebuilding period as they try to retool on the fly. Then, you have a bit of a break for almost a full week. You get the Sharks at home. San Jose is going to be a very young team, and we're going to get to see Macklin Celebrini for the first time, if all goes well. Should be a really fun home game. Winnipeg has like a whole stretch of home games here, which is nice. Again, I wished it started the season at home, but, it is what it is. Then you get Pittsburgh a couple days later, which, the Pens are also a team that's kind of retooling on the fly. I don't quite know what their plan is exactly, other than just trying to extend the last few years of Crosby and Malkin for as much as it's worth. Pittsburgh's in a weird division now where the Metro has definitely improved with Carolina and Washington all making some big moves. But other than that, there's not a ton of teams that I think that they probably worry too much about. I mean, still the Rangers are going to be top, and I would expect most of the other teams to be either sort of mid-table or whatever. The Canes obviously will be, right there fighting with the Rangers for top of the division. But otherwise, there's some opportunity for a better Penguins team to try and do something. Then kind of wrapping up the back half of October, you're starting to get some fun games. You've got St. Louis on the road, and then you've also got the Kraken on the road, and then a game against Calgary, which should be, interesting. I mean, these are teams that are, I would say, not exactly the strongest opponents. I would say of those three, maybe the Kraken are going to be the most difficult, but everyone else has kind of been in a state of either rebuilding or retooling, which seems to be a theme for a lot of teams that have hit a lot of those veterancy stages. A lot of them are aging, and quite frankly, their rosters just aren't able to keep up the way they used to. Then, at the end of the month, you get a nice little Atlantic tour. I think the game that people are probably going to circle on the calendar is October 28th. It's going to be a home game against the Toronto Maple Leafs. Exciting times. Toronto is just running it back, so their running it back tends to be a lot better than most other teams, but for the Jets, kind of a measuring stick. You're facing a top offense. You want to see what Arnie's army is going to put together after a couple weeks together, so this could be a really big test. And then you have a road game against Detroit. I guess Detroit's going to be decent, but I don't know. They're a strange team. Every time I look at the Yzer plan, I don't really know what to read into it, what to make of it. And so I just tend to be a little bit underwhelmed by what he's assembled. But October should be a fun month. I don't see a lot of top-end teams. Aside from a Stanley Cup finalist and the Leafs, I think this is going to be a relatively softer schedule, which if you're talking about a brand new coach for the Jets who has managed the Jets in interim status before, but not really as a full-time head coach, this should be a nice introduction into the role, and it should give him some time to sort of make some adjustments and stuff before we start to head into November. And we also get our first taste of Utah in early November too. So lots of fun. I think this should be a nice opener to the season, and I'm hoping the Jets can come away with a quality winning record. Let me know what you're thinking for the opening of the season. Are you excited to see the Oilers again, especially a team that, compares quite favorably to Winnipeg's own record of success? Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. As always, I thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow with more off-season coverage, so see you then. And as always, have a great night and go Jets go.